Okay, so on to chapter 2 of Rambam's Mishnah Torah Sefer Hamada. In the first chapter, we talked about God a little bit and the nature of his existence and how he has a distinct characteristic that makes him separate from everything else, and that he exists just by virtue of himself without any external cause. And this is unlike everything else which has a cause, namely God being the cause. So now in chapter 2, Maimonides is going to talk about how God is active in the world. So let's see inside. Not only is it a mitzvah to know about the existence of God and the way he exists, but it's also a mitzvah to love and fear God. And how does one love and fear God? He attains knowledge. He attains knowledge of God, how he's acting in the world, knowledge of the world itself, how things relate together, increasing in wisdom in general. And by this, he fulfills this mitzvah. And in addition, the purpose of man is to enjoy the life of the intellect. So not only is this a mitzvah, but it's a good and pleasurable thing to do. Maimonides talks about some ideas concerning God, which emerge from the axioms that we established in the first chapter, saying that God does not possess a physical form, but he's entirely intellectual. And he begins to talk about how God is acting in the world, how God is acting in the world intellectually, and how God is acting in the world physically. How God is acting in the world intellectually is generally referred to as Maisa Merkava, the work of the chariot, or by Aristotle, he would call it metaphysics. And how he's acting in the world physically is referred to as Maisa Bereshis, the work of creation, and Aristotle would refer to it as physics. Maisa Merkava, the name is derived, it means the work of the chariot. And this is a reference to the chariot perceived by Ezekiel in his vision by the river Chebar in Babylon. And it gives a description of various different types of angels. Maimonides mentions that the subject matter of this chapter, while it pertains to Maisa Merkava, is like a drop in the ocean, and there's much more to be investigated regarding it, and he's just outlining the basics. And then later we'll see in chapter 3, when we talk about Maisa Bereshis, he refers to the chapter content as a drop in a bucket. So a little bit more. So Merkava he calls a drop in the ocean, and Maisa Bereshis he calls a drop in a bucket. So the implication is that Maisa Merkava is a little bit more complex than Maisa Bereshis. Okay, so we established in the first chapter that the essential characteristic of God is that he is holy and separate and has no external cause, just exists perfectly. And since he exists perfectly, this implies that he is unchanging, that there's no concept of potentiality in him, as we mentioned, talking about the first chapter. So if that's the case, then how can it be said that God is active in the universe? And the way God is active in the universe is via angels or messengers. In Hebrew, they're called malachim, which literally means messengers. And this is why angels exist. They're mentioned frequently throughout the Bible. And this is, this is why they're necessary, because what we've established about the nature of God, that he is not at one moment talking and another moment not, at one moment splitting the sea and the other moment not. It's not that God is literally doing these things. Rather, there are messengers who act on his behalf in the world, called angels. And whenever God is acting in the world, it's always via an angel. This is why angels exist. You will find people argue on this idea. They will say that sometimes God is actually doing something himself, or that God is actually in the universe in some ways. But this, according to Maimonides, this is not an accurate conception. Rather, according to Maimonides, whenever God is acting, it's always through an angel. In this chapter, Maimonides talks about the nature of angels, that they are a type of emanation, that there are some angels which are closest to God and they influence levels of angels, and then there's levels of angels that are closest to man. This is a very general outline. That I would say the general idea to take away from this is that there is a series of emanations where one affects the other, but the specifics of it we won't go into, because it's a little complicated and there's lots of disagreement on it. It's sufficient to know that God acts in the world through angels.